Okay, we're started now. Okay, so we're going to continue on this sort of similar vein, talking about the environment and different components of the environment which determine the types of ecology that we see, the types of organisms that live in an area, and how the ecosystems in different areas function, how the environment essentially supports life. Before I get into today's lecture, I want to go through another one of these little, just for fun, pop quizzes. This isn't graded, this is really for your benefit, as well as for mine. And I've got 3 or 4 of these these are sample questions characteristic of the types of things that you'll ask in the exams. So, a team of ecologists is examining how successful different types of refuges are at maintaining herbivore. How did that? I didn't even touch anything. There's a timer on it. Okay, we're going to have to be quick, eh? Right, so that's conservation ecology. Next one. Calculating the degrees of freedom for an experiment is a critical step in conducting statistical analyses. Which of the following is true? Turn that on, that would be a bit better. Degrees of freedom are calculated using statistical tables. Degrees of freedom relate to the complexity of an experiment. Increasing sample size never increases the degrees of freedom. All of A to C. This is an absolute chance. Okay? Degrees of freedom relate to the complexity of the experiment. Remember that we used degrees of freedom and the t statistic to estimate the p-value. The probability that we could see that t statistic by chance. Now we've got to manage this. Here is the formula for calculation of the t statistic. Which of the following is true? Which of the following will make the t value smaller? If the sample sizes are larger, sample sizes are smaller, standard deviations are larger, standard deviations are smaller. Correct answer is B and C. Okay? You won't be asked, I won't set you a slide like this with an empty block box over here that says which character should be in that box. But you will have to understand what's happening in that statistic, in that analysis. And here you can even quite simply put in some values. Just put in some dummy numbers and run it through your head, get an answer out that way. Yeah? It's not terribly complicated. If you've been following the lectures and doing a little bit of reading and understanding what I'm talking about, you should be able to follow through with this. Okay. This worked. I tried this before I came in here this morning. This worked, but there we go. Okay. So quadrats and gillnets are frequently used by ecologists to measure the abundance of plants and fishes respectively. What type of measurement do we get from each? Quadrats provide an estimate of relative abundance, whereas gillnets provide an estimate of absolute abundance. Remember, these are 2 different methods. We talked about these in class, yeah? Alternatively, quadrats provide an estimate of absolute abundance. Gillnets provide an estimate of relative abundance. Both methods give us absolutes. Both methods give us relative, and fish are more interesting, so that's pretty much the answer. We talked about these 2 methods. Okay, I'm going to stop for a quick moment because I need to figure out exactly what's going on with this. Just bear with me for a sec, because this is going. Okay, so let's hope that has solved our problem. Okay, so anybody who answers E will have my undying love, gratitude, and respect, but unfortunately you won't have the mark because this is multiple choice. So depending where your priorities lie, I'd probably recommend that you go with the correct answer, which in this instance is that quadrats give us an estimate of absolute abundance, remember they put out a square, count the number of plants, multiply that up by the size of the total area, and you've got an estimate of the abundance of each plant in the total area. Whereas gill nets, we use a standardized method, see how many fish we catch in one lake. Do we catch more, fewer fish in another lake? We can say is lake 1 has more fish or less fish than lake 2. We're getting a relative abundance, but we're not saying how many fish there are in the lake. Okay, so that's the type of questions that I set in the exam for this. If you're able to follow that, even when you're given the answers, you're doing great. If you're able to follow it without being given the answers, you're probably doing even better. If you're not able to follow that, you definitely know that you need to spend a bit more time going over what we talk about in lectures, using the books in the library, or if you have it yourself. Okay, so for the remainder of this talk or lecture, and probably into the next one, we're going to talk about land and life on land. In the previous couple of lectures, we've talked about how climate influences what type of plants and animals can grow in an area. We've talked about how life has to be adapted to an aquatic environment. But now we're going to talk about life on Earth, life on land. And initially, we're going to discuss this in terms of five traits or 5 characteristics of life on land, which plants and life have to be adapted to, which determine the types of plants and animals that can exist in an area. First of these, desiccation, we'll talk about in a minute. Then gravity, anything on Earth that is where all have the force of gravity acting upon it. We need to, or that regulates how life on Earth can exist. Light, the amount of light that different plants in different areas receive will determine what type of plants grow, how they grow, and then by inference, that determines what type of animals can exist around these plants or consumers. Temperature, we'll talk a bit about adaptation to temperature. It's a very different environment on land than it is in the water. And then we're going to talk quite a bit about soil. And this is probably going to run into the lecture on Friday. Soil is really, really important. It's straightforward and determines, in addition to these other characteristics, what type of plants can grow in an area. We can have perfect amount of sunlight, perfect amount of water, a perfect amount of rainfall, but if the soil isn't correct, no plants can grow, no life can exist. So we're going to talk quite a bit about soil as the sort of the basis for terrestrial food webs and for terrestrial life. So first of all, I want to start with this little run through. We'll talk about desiccation, losing moisture, trying to maintain moisture. As we discussed in the lecture on Monday, water is essential for life. We as mammals our bodies hold a lot of water. All the intercellular reactions, the stuff that goes on within plants, the transport of nutrients, is all due to having sufficient water within the organism to allow these reactions to occur, to allow these interactions to take place. So water is really, really important. It's the medium to which life has evolved, to which life has adapted. If we look back through geological time, we can see that life first came about in the seas, and life evolved in the oceans or in the seas long before it moved or transitioned onto Earth. In terms of basic unicellular plants or bacteria, we've even got those up to dates are still uncertain, but we can sort of go back past to a billion years ago. We've got the earliest proteomic life, say. That leads to algae in an aquatic environment. We see the first sort of colonization of land by aquatic plants, or by plants and by algae. around about 500 million years ago. So we've got almost half the amount of time that algae have been existing on Earth. They were confined to an aquatic environment. So it's only relatively recently, in geological time, that they've been able to colonize and exist on land. You can see the exact same type of traits for animals, for chordates. So we've got fishes, first evolved around about, chordates around about 400, 500 million years ago. We've got the first amphibians or reptiles that were sort of considered truly vertebrate, truly terrestrial vertebrates that can exist their entire life cycle in a terrestrial biome without having to return to water. There's a gap there of around about 250 million years. And again, we're thinking, or the time frames are around about half the amount of time that animals, as we would see them, have existed. They were confined to an aquatic environment. They were confined to the seas, to marine life. So this tells us something really critical, that we can sort of say that maybe we have 250 million years that plants had colonized the land, but animals had not. So there's an abundance of resources there available for animals if they can colonize the land. But it takes a long, long time for them to be able to make that step, to be able to make that jump from an aquatic environment into a terrestrial. And that's because life on Earth, or life in a terrestrial environment, is very, very different. And there's a whole host of different challenges to life in a marine environment. And one of the obvious ones, one of the first things that becomes apparent, is desiccation. So the air is not water saturated. It might feel like that in July in New Brunswick sometimes, but for the majority of the time, the air is not water saturated, which means there's constantly evaporation. If you are a consumer or an organism that's 70% water, and you're in an arid environment, that water wants to get out of your body. The air is trying to absorb that water out all the time. And if you're an organism that needs water to transport nutrients around your body, to allow your cells to work, that's an extremely challenging environment, inhospitable environment for you to exist in. And plants and animals have to develop techniques to resist desiccation. They've had to develop to become adapted to a range of temperatures and humidities, and also to be able to use, better control their internal use of water, how they keep themselves cool, how they move water around their body and avoiding desiccation. The next challenge is gravity. We don't think of gravity as a particularly strong force. It's a relatively weak force, but it's a constant force. And it's a real challenge to any organisms trying to live on Earth, trying to compete for resources and exist on Earth. We talked a bit in the climate lecture about plants competing for light. And it's beneficial. So we've got saying, why are trees tall and skinny? Because it allows them to get as high as possible with the least amount of resources. They can get as high as possible to get more light. You constantly want to be above your competitor. The higher you are above your competitor, the more light you're getting, the more of that resource you're able to get. Gravity is one of the key restraints to that. Gravity, when you're trying to grow higher and higher and higher to get more and more light, you're constantly pushing against the force of gravity. The most stark examples of this are sort of the redwood forests we see on the west coast. And these are amongst the largest and oldest trees on the planet. Of many they can grow to over 100 meters in height, but they have a 9-meter diameter. And the vast majority of their tissues, of their structure, the reason they have to be so wide is to give the plants support, or to give the trees support, so they can maintain their structure as they try to force further and further higher against the force of gravity. We see the same thing, the exact same thing in animals. Even over there, versus or against or in comparison to the largest land animals that have existed, and marine animals that have existed on Earth. The largest land animal that we know of at the moment is Argentinosaurus. At its shoulder height is around about 7 meters. It could get higher than that with its elongated neck. Its full body length is estimated around about 35 meters. But if you're pushing that head up to get at leaves and things that are, it's the same concept as trees trying to get above each other. The longer your neck is, the higher up you're able to forage. You can get higher up than any of your competitors. So it's beneficial, it's very beneficial to have a long neck that you can get up and get resources that your competitors can't get. But if you have a long neck and your brain is up here, you need to have a heart that's big enough and a circulatory system that's strong enough to pump blood at least 7 meters high, potentially up to 20 meters high, regularly. And that's a real pressure because you're fighting against gravity. You're trying to pump that blood upwards 15 meters. So there's, particularly we see for terrestrial animals, that height is a limiting factor. They cannot, because they're constantly, as the way our biology works, they're fighting against gravity to be high, to be taller and taller. This is less of an issue for, it's not an issue for marine animals, because they're in an aquatic environment. Gravity is not the key determinant. We talked about life in the aquatic environment on Monday. And this allows large marine animals, like blue whale, can grow to sizes far in excess of terrestrial animals because of their environment, because they're not, one of the key determinants is that they're not fighting against gravity to increase their body size. Next thing we want to talk a bit more about is light. So when we talked a bit or covered it a little bit when we discussed trees, that light is the key determinant for photosynthesis. It's what, certainly in terms of their upward growth, it's what plants are competing for. We discussed a bit about this in previous lectures, how light is not evenly distributed across the Earth, or certainly solar radiation, the power from light, is not evenly distributed across the Earth. But even once the light hits the Earth, be it at equatorial or higher latitude, even then there's further breakdown or further disruption in how the light is partitioned amongst plants. So we can sort of see this as 100% of light comes in, hits the forest canopy, some proportion of it is reflected back. The majority of it, though, is absorbed by plants. Essentially the first leaf that light hits will get the majority of that energy. So the majority, 80% in this estimate here, is absorbed at the forest canopy. That leaves a much smaller amount to get through to the understory layers. 7% through to a shrub layer, 2% maybe getting right down to forest floor. This trait, or the way that light is divided up like this, leads to the distribution of plants within a forest that we see. We do characterize plants, we observe different strata of plants existing within a forest biome. At the top of the highest layer are trees, large forest canopy layer. Below those, we can have a shrub layer, and below that again, herb layer, and then quite close to actually on the forest floor, we've got thallophytes, which are things like non-vascular plants, fungi, algae, things like that actually exist just solely on the forest floor. There's a couple of little tweaks and quirks of this. We get things like epiphytes, which are plants which can grow on other plants. So you could have a herb epiphyte that's growing quite high, or a lichen or something like that. That's growing quite high because it's growing on a tree near the forest canopy. And similarly, we get things like lianas or vines that can actually climb up a tree or climb up a shrub and get access to light that way. But the same, in general, what we're seeing is this distribution of light as it comes down through the forest system is broken up, and it leads to plants have adapted to this distribution. Plants have adapted to this environment. As well as spatial distribution of light, we see temporal distribution of light. It's different in different either what we'll see now in different seasons, but also even in different times of the day. So this is a plot that comes from the textbook. What we're seeing on the x-axis here is the proportion of available light at the top of the canopy. And the y-axis is the height above ground. So if you are 30 meters high, you're getting all of the light that's available at the top of the canopy. You're top of the forest, you're that first leaf, you're absorbing 100%, and you can absorb 100% of that light that comes in. As we go down through the forest layers, we see that this is initially a very, very steep decline in the amount of light that's available to you, and that kind of slows down a little bit. But we can match that in with this figure that we see here. We're seeing that the vast majority of light is absorbed here. As we go down, we've lost very quickly the majority of light. And as we get down lower, it's slower, the last little bits of light are used up. This pattern, at least in a deciduous forest that we see in somewhere like in New Brunswick, varies seasonally because of the characteristics of the environment. Let's move through seasons in a deciduous forest. We've got spring, leaf out, full summer, move into fall, winter, back to spring. So relate that to what we see here. What's happening? In full summer and in fall, when there's more leaves on the tree, certain more leaves on the canopy layer, they're absorbing a greater proportion of the light. In winter and in early spring, those leaves are not out. So there's more of that light is coming through, more light is hitting the forest floor because the deciduous plants have dropped their leaves. So we see these patterns in not only the absolute availability of light at different heights, but that the degree to which light differs between different heights is influenced by the season. And that has real ecological consequences. Most understory shrub or herb layer plants are adapted to this, and they will have the majority of their growth and their leaf out and their blooms will be timed earlier in the season than the canopy layer, because they're maximizing the period of time that they can get their light. Once the canopy layer, once those larger trees have had their leaf out, then the availability of light to the understory layer massively decreases. So quite often, this is what we see if you're walking through a forest in the spring. Quite often you'll see that understory layer is already turning green, or we already start to see flowers at the understory before the canopy is fully out. Once that happens, then that's the initial cue for pollinators to become active. This is their first, quite often their first meal or their first period of activity is timed to coincide with this leaf out at the understory layer, which is determined by the timing of the maximum amount of light, or the maximum relative amount of light hitting that forest floor. There's also changes within a day, and we see this in plants. That's what are called circadian rhythms. The plants may open their flowers in the middle of the day and close up again at nightfall. And this is determined by when light is hitting the flower. During the daytime, they're getting the most amount of light hitting the plant. At nighttime, far less light is hitting the plant. This light drives direct by biochemical reactions. You don't need to know the details of what's happening in here at the moment. You don't need to know the biochemistry. It's absolutely fascinating if you're into that type of thing. But for now, the main point here to get across is that it's light, particles of light hitting the leaf that stimulate this reaction at a biochemical level. So light is determining what plants are doing on a daily basis, on a seasonal basis, and over their entire life history. It's determining everything from the spatial distribution among those layers of the plants through to the time of day that they open their flowers. And as we see, animals, pollinators, are adapted to that. They will time their day or time their peak activity associated with when these flowers are in bloom. Next thing to talk a little bit about is temperature, kind of associated with light, but not all. One of the key, similar to desiccation and the need to conserve water, adaptation to temperature is one of the key constraints that restricts or delays the colonization of land by aquatic plants, by aquatic organisms. And one of the main reasons for this, we talked a bit about this in previous lectures, is the degree to which land warms and cools much faster than water. Here's two plots of the diurnal range in temperature. So the maximum and minimum temperature, the range between the maximum and minimum temperature that you can find in any 24-hour period. In the oceans, this is really small in terms of degrees. The maximum, this plot here, it comes from, I think it's from NASA, it is NASA data. No, it's Hadley Centre in the UK. The maximum range is 0.5 of a degree. So for any of these blocks of ocean that are measuring temperature right the way through the day, the maximum change in water temperature from middle of the night to middle of the day is 0.5 of a degree. Very, very stable. Fits in with what we talked about when we talked about water. It warms and it cools very, very slowly. Contrast that with life on land. So each of these cells here represents the same thing, maximum and range of maximum and minimum temperature on land. We can get ranges in excess, well in excess of 20 degrees C. So if you are an organism living in an aquatic environment, your temperature, certainly on a daily cycle, pretty steady, almost flat lines. Whereas if you're living on a terrestrial environment, you have to cope with huge peaks and troughs in the temperature that you're exposed to. Plants and animals have come up with a whole host of different adaptations to overcome this. We take some different photosynthetic pathways we see in plants. So here we've got characteristics of C3, C4, and CAM photosynthetic pathways. C3, sort of characteristic of wheat. During the daytime, for photosynthesis to occur, the stomata must be open to absorb CO2. When the stomata are open, CO2 can come in, but water is lost. So if you're in a very hot or arid environment, whenever you have your stomata open, you're losing water. Because when we talked about this transpiration, water leaving the plants. So if you need to be adapted, or if you're trying to adapt to an environment which has a large peaking or peaks and troughs in temperature, this is a very poor system to be, or it's a very ineffective or inefficient water control system if you need to develop your energy. Slightly or a much considerably more effective method is C4 photosynthesis, where essentially same things are occurring. You need to have your stomata open, but you've got a more efficient photosynthetic pathway, so you don't need to have your stomata open for as much of the time. So you're generating the same amount of energy for less loss. You need to have less CO2 in, you need to have less, you've got your stomata open for a shorter period of time, so you're losing less water. Take this to the next level, is in CAM plants. And CAM plants can actually time, they break photosynthesis down into two phases. During the nighttime, they open their stomata, take in CO2, store that as malate or malic acid within their cells, and then during daytime, they can close their stomata and photosynthesize using that carbon. This allows them to keep their stomata closed during the peak of the day, or during the hottest period of the day, maintain their water, but also have a relatively efficient photosynthetic pathway. And this is what we see in a lot of cacti and plants that are adapted to particularly arid environments. And it's one way that plants can overcome this large variation, or these large cycles in temperature. Later in the course, you're going to hear a lot more from Professor Peake about how plants, and particularly animals, have adapted to this type of environment, or how they adapted to variation in temperature. We talk about endothermy and ectothermy, homeothermy versus poikilothermy. Well, I'm going to leave that for the moment, and Professor Peake will work with that later on. So the final thing I want to talk about in this particular component is soil. And soil is essential. It's one of the key determinants of life on Earth, of what type of plants can grow in an area. For definition, we can consider soil to be loose material below vegetation but above hard rock. However, there's a lot of variability within soil. It's the primary medium which for plants in which plants grow. It also hosts a large diversity of animal life and microbial life. And in a couple of lectures, we're going to talk about nutrient cycling and how decomposition occurs within the soil, and nutrients through that microbial and animal life are brought back into the soil and reused, re-energized. The characteristics of the soil, from its chemical characteristics to its physical properties, will determine how much water it can hold, which directly determines how much water is available to plants that exist within it, and the types of nutrients that are available within the soil. And these, in terms of plants, these are two of the main traits, soil traits, which are characteristics which will control the type of plants that exist in an area. And two of the key things that we're going to discuss in more detail about soil. The quality or the type of soil that we have in any area really depends on these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different sort of specific traits. The parent material, what the soil is composed of, the climate, the temperature, the amount of water, the wind exposure in the area, biota, what type of biotic communities exist within the soil. The topography, is it on a steep slope or a shallow, gentle slope? And the amount of time that soil has existed. So for the remainder of this lecture, we're going to run through these in a bit more detail. This will take us on into what we're going to talk about on Friday. So initially, the parent material, soil, will be determined by what its constituent material is, what it's made of. Is it bedrock, or is it from transported finer material, by that sand, volcanic ash, things like that can be moved to an area and deposited? Even within the bedrock, we can compare or can imagine that the soils that would form over a very hard granite versus a soft sandstone or shale or something like that would be very, very different. Their particle size would be different because it's going to be much harder for weathering or biotic material, biotic activities to break down that harder rock. The chemical nature will also be different. If you've got a soil that's developed over an acidic granite versus an alkaline limestone, something like that, the chemical properties of the soil will be very, very different, depend on the bedrock they're formed from. Their chemical properties, their pH will be different. Different plants are adapted to those different types of pHs. So that in turn will determine what type of plants exist on this soil, right, beginning from the bedrock. You can also have particular traits or particular chemical compositions in soil which restrict plant growth. One of the most obvious of these are serpentine soils, which have a chemical composition which inhibits plant growth. And we can see, or quite often you see, these serpentine barrens, which essentially is an area of good quality fertile soil, lots of plant growth, and a zone or outcropping of serpentine, or mineral serpentine within this zone, within this area, restricts plant growth, particularly at that site, solely due to the chemistry or the chemical composition of the soil. Next, we can talk about climate. Typically in warmer, more productive areas with higher rainfall, we see more organic growth. More organic growth leads to greater, or can lead to, certainly a warm environment, will lead to faster decomposition. So you've got more organic material in the soil. But if you've got a lot of rainfall, certainly if that's focused in particular areas, that can lead to a very high leaching rate, leaching those nutrients out from the soil. So depending on what part of the earth you're in, or depending on what climate characteristics of the region you're in has, that will determine the type of soil. We take sort of 3 examples here from a northern tundra. We've got some permafrost here, which is areas that have never actually thawed out. seasonally, lots and lots of light in the summer, but very little light in the winter. Lots of snowfall, cold area, very few plants can grow. So we've got it's dominated by just a few small growth species of plants, very little biotic material, very little. So from year to year, the amount of new organic material that builds up on that soil will be very low. We move to a more temperate climate, so New Brunswick or Ireland, and here the soils are quite often are thicker, are deeper. There's more organic growth within any year. That's getting absorbed and built up into the soil. We move all the way to the tropics, where we can have massive organic growth. But actually, also we'll see in subsequent lectures, very high leaching rates. So here, despite there being an awful lot of growth, the soils are actually very, very poor quality. There's not much nutrients getting into the soil. It's all being used up within that biotic layer before it gets back down into the soil. What does get through is very quickly leached out due to monsoon high rainfall events. The types of biotic communities within the soil also have an influence. Plant roots, you get in and break up soil. They will then contribute to the organic material. Fungi can grow on this, release, or they can break it, release these nutrients from that organic material back into the soil. The topography will also, here we've got the topography, the degree of slope will also have a strong influence on the type of soil. This is an example of a steep slope or a talus slope, where we've got very, very steep slope, lots of erosion, lots of runoff. We get a rainfall event on there. It's washing a lot of that soil away. Very shallow soils, not much opportunity for organic material to accumulate, not much opportunity for a good, deep, thick soil to develop. Very low low abundance of biotic material. You contrast that with a valley, where you've got all that runoff is building up within the valley or the mountain floor, or the foot of the mountain, and there you've got a lot of this, whatever organic material was there, is being brought down. More lower incline slope, more opportunity for the soils to develop and to grow. Finally, the amount of time that the soil has existed. Soil, as we sort of discussed, starts as bedrock, as bare rock. This is colonized initially by what are termed as pioneer species, lichens, small annual plants, grasses, that can exist in very shallow soils. They don't need a deep soil. And that'll be the first sort of weathering that they will start to break up the soils, that start to add as they die, they'll add their organic material to the soils. Creates an environment or soil that's suitable for other grasses, shrubs, some small trees. They in turn break down the soil, host larger biotic communities, build up the biotic components of the soil more, or the organic components of the soil more, and eventually create an environment that is suitable and hospitable for large trees, and even shade-tolerant understory growth within a forest canopy, within a forest environment. A quick example of this, just to finish off on, we see this in some of the most lush biodiverse forests on the planet. We can take examples of Hawaii or Pacific Islands, where the entire soil or the entire landmass is formed as molten lava. Once that hardens and once that cools, very quickly colonized by some basic pioneer species like ferns or lichens, Over time, we start to see the development of intermediate species, until we see a full, what's termed as a climax community, a full, diverse biotic community. In Hawaii, what we saw, or there was, people might have seen in the news, was a series of lava events, a series of volcanoes in Hawaii this year, and they actually wiped out or consumed a lot of the remaining old growth forest and some on the Big Island in Hawaii. So this is a cycle that continues to continuously occur. But the reason we see this, or we can see this lush rainforest existing on what was just a rock of lava, is due to this soil formation through colonization. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that for today, and we'll pick up with this on Friday. All right, enjoy the rest of your week.